I'm sitting in this mahogany-paneled office, surrounded by people who should feel like family, but instead feel like vultures circling a fresh kill. The leather chair beneath me is cold, and I can feel my mother-in-law's eyes burning into the side of my face, like she's already calculating how to divide up whatever scraps might be left for me. I thought today would bring closure after losing my father 3 months ago. Instead, it destroyed everything I believed about family, love, and the man who raised me to always see the good in people. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how a will reading turned into the most devastating and ultimately liberating day of my life. Let me take you back to understand how we got here. My father, Robert Chen, was the kind of man who fixed neighbors' leaky faucets without being asked and remembered every grandchild's birthday, even the ones who barely visited. He was a retired electrician who'd built a modest but comfortable life through decades of honest work and careful saving. I'd always been his little bird. That's what he called me since I was 5 years old, when I used to follow him around the house while he did repairs, chattering away about everything and nothing. While my brother Michael chased promotions in California and called maybe twice a year, I was the one who drove Dad to doctor's appointments, helped him organize his medications, and spent Sunday afternoons listening to his stories about growing up during the Depression and building a life with my mother. When I married David 5 years ago, I genuinely believed I was gaining a family. The Hartmans were everything my small, working-class family wasn't: wealthy, connected, influential in ways that seemed almost magical to someone like me. David's father owned 3 successful car dealerships across the state. His mother, Patricia, had never worked a day in her life, but somehow managed to make everyone around her feel inadequate with just a look or a carefully chosen word. From the very first family dinner, they made it crystal clear that I wasn't good enough for their precious son. I was a public school teacher from a working-class background. Patricia's exact words, always delivered with that particular smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind of smile that cuts deeper than any insult. David would defend me when we were alone, telling me his parents just needed time to get to know me, that they'd come around once they saw how much he loved me. But somehow he never found his voice when his family was actually in the room, never stood up to his mother's passive-aggressive comments, or his father's dismissive attitude toward my career and background. I started to feel like I was living 2 different lives, one where I was loved and valued by my husband, and another where I was barely tolerated by the people who were supposed to become my new family. But my father saw through them immediately, with that intuition he'd developed over 70 years of dealing with all kinds of people. "Little bird," he told me, after our first family dinner together, "some people measure wealth by what they own, others measure it by what they give. You'll figure out which kind of family you married into soon enough." I should have listened to him then, should have paid attention to the way his jaw tightened whenever David's name came up in conversation, should have noticed how he always changed the subject when I talked about my in-laws' latest acts of generosity. The problems really started about 8 months ago when Dad's health began declining in ways that scared me more than I wanted to admit. What began as occasional dizziness and moments of confusion turned into more frequent falls, memory lapses that lasted longer each time, and eventually a diagnosis that hit me like a physical blow: early-stage dementia mixed with heart problems that were getting worse despite medication. The doctor explained it gently but clearly. My father's mind was going to fade gradually, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. That's when the Hartmans suddenly became very, very interested in my father's well-being, in ways that should have set off alarm bells, but instead filled me with guilty relief. Patricia started showing up at Dad's house with elaborate casseroles and homemade soups, telling anyone who would listen that poor Sarah was so overwhelmed with teaching and taking care of Robert, and that they were just trying to help family during a difficult time. She'd arrive with cleaning supplies and spend hours organizing Dad's kitchen, rearranging his medications, and asking detailed questions about his finances and insurance policies, always framing it as concern for his safety and independence. David began insisting on driving Dad to medical appointments, claiming that I was too emotional to handle the technical discussions with doctors, and that Dad needed someone who could ask the right questions and understand the medical terminology without getting overwhelmed. "You're too close to this, Sarah," he'd say, rubbing my shoulders in that way that was supposed to be comforting, but felt more like restraint. "Dad needs an advocate who can think clearly and make rational decisions. Let me handle the medical stuff so you can focus on just being his daughter." At first, I was genuinely grateful for their help. Teaching full-time while caring for a parent with dementia was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated, emotionally and physically draining in ways that left me feeling like I was failing at everything. I thought maybe I'd been wrong about my in-laws all along. Maybe they really were trying to help. Maybe this crisis was bringing out the best in them and showing me a side of their family I'd never seen before. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. Small inconsistencies that grew into a pattern I couldn't ignore. Dad would mention conversations about his future that I'd never heard about. Decisions that apparently needed to be made that no one had discussed with me. "David says, you think I should move to that assisted living place downtown," he'd say, looking confused and a little hurt. But I told him, "You'd never want that for me. That you'd want me to stay in my own house as long as possible." I'd never said anything about assisted living, had never even considered it as an option, but somehow David was having conversations with my father about my supposed wishes and concerns. Or Patricia would reference private family matters during her visits, details about Dad's financial situation, his insurance policies, even intimate stories about his relationship with my mother before she passed. Things she couldn't possibly know unless someone had been sharing information that wasn't theirs to share. She'd mention specific dollar amounts in his savings account, talk about the value of his house like she'd had it appraised, discuss his will and estate planning in ways that made it clear she knew far more about his affairs than I did. When I confronted David about these conversations, about why he was discussing my father's private business with his parents, he got defensive in a way that was completely unlike him. "My family cares about your father, Sarah," he'd say, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd started to dread. "They're trying to help, and you're being paranoid and suspicious for no reason. Maybe you're the one who's too stressed to see clearly, too emotional to recognize genuine concern when you see it." That phrase, "too stressed to see clearly," became his standard response whenever I questioned anything his family did or said. Like I was the problem, like my concerns weren't valid because I was grieving and overwhelmed, like my emotional investment in my father's well-being somehow disqualified me from making rational decisions about his care. It was gaslighting at its most insidious, making me doubt my own perceptions and instincts at the exact moment when I needed to trust them most. The isolation was gradual but deliberate, so subtle that I didn't recognize it as manipulation until it was too late to stop it. David would schedule family dinners and social obligations on the same nights I usually visited Dad, claiming that his parents had limited availability and that we needed to prioritize family time. Patricia would call my father during the hours she knew I was teaching, filling his increasingly confused mind with suggestions about how overwhelmed and stressed I looked, how maybe he needed more help than one person could provide, how lucky he was to have people who cared enough to step in when his daughter was struggling. They painted themselves as the solution to problems they were creating, positioning themselves as the stable, reliable support system, while making me look like the emotional, unreliable daughter who meant well, but couldn't handle the practical realities of caregiving. They spoke to Dad in the language of authority and expertise, using medical terms and financial jargon that impressed him and made my simple heartfelt concern seem naive and inadequate by comparison. I started finding legal documents on Dad's kitchen table that I'd never seen before, power of attorney forms, financial planning brochures, even applications for assisted living facilities that someone had filled out partially in handwriting I didn't recognize. When I asked Dad about them, he'd look confused and say David had brought them by just in case, but he couldn't remember the specific conversations clearly enough to explain what just in case meant or why these decisions were being made without including me. The worst part was watching my father's trust in me slowly erode under the constant pressure of their suggestions and implications. He'd been sharp as a tack his whole life, able to fix anything and solve any problem through sheer determination and practical intelligence. But the dementia made him vulnerable to suggestion, especially from people who spoke with confidence and authority about things he was starting to forget how to manage. David would use medical terminology and financial concepts that impressed Dad, making me sound like a well-meaning but unprepared daughter who didn't understand the complexities of modern healthcare and estate planning. Sarah means well, but she doesn't understand the legal implications of these decisions, Robert. David would say during visits I wasn't invited to attend. We just want to make sure you're protected, that your assets are structured in a way that will benefit Sarah in the long run. She's too emotional right now to think about these practical matters, but someone needs to make sure your wishes are properly documented and legally sound. I felt like I was losing my father twice, once to the disease that was stealing his memories and personality, and once to people who saw his confusion as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. Every conversation became a battle for his attention and trust, with me trying to maintain our lifelong connection, while they systematically undermined my credibility and positioned themselves as the responsible adults in the room. 3 months ago, Dad had a massive heart attack that changed everything in ways I'm still trying to process. I was at school when it happened, teaching a room full of 7th graders about the Revolutionary War when my phone buzzed with a call from David. "Your father's in the hospital," he said, his voice strangely calm and controlled. "We're here with him now, you should come quickly, but don't panic. The doctors are taking good care of him." The drive to the hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life, my mind racing between memories of our last conversation and fears about what I might find when I got there. I kept thinking about how Dad had seemed more confused than usual lately, asking me questions about people I'd never heard of and events that hadn't happened, getting frustrated when his mind couldn't hold onto thoughts the way it used to. I'd been patient with him, but I could see the fear in his eyes when he realized he was losing pieces of himself, when he couldn't remember things that had been important to him his whole life. When I arrived at the hospital, the Hartmans were already there, clustered around Dad's bed like they belonged there more than I did. Like they were the primary family and I was just another visitor. Patricia was holding his hand and speaking in that soft, nurturing voice she reserved for public displays of compassion, telling him how much they all loved him and how they were going to take care of everything. David was talking to the doctor about treatment options and prognosis, taking charge in that authoritative way that made everyone assume he was the primary caregiver and decision-maker. Dad was conscious but weak, his face pale against the white hospital pillows, machines beeping around him in a rhythm that somehow made everything feel more urgent and fragile. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with recognition that filled me with relief. "Little bird," he whispered, and I felt that familiar surge of connection that had sustained us through all the confusion and difficulty of the past months. I moved to his other side, taking his free hand, and for a moment it felt like we were connected again, like the manipulation and gaslighting of the past months hadn't driven a wedge between us. But then Patricia squeezed his other hand and said, "Robert, we've been talking to the doctor about your care and your future. David thinks it might be time to make some important decisions about your living situation and your financial affairs. We want to make sure Sarah doesn't have to carry this burden alone, that she has the support she needs during this difficult time." Dad looked between us, his eyes cloudy with medication and confusion, and I could see him struggling to process what was being said, trying to understand why these decisions were being made around him rather than with him. I wanted to scream, wanted to tell them to get away from my father, to stop manipulating him when he was at his most vulnerable and scared. But this was a hospital room and Dad was dying, and making a scene felt like the worst possible thing I could do for his peace of mind. So I stayed quiet and watched them continue their careful manipulation, even as my father's life hung in the balance and every moment felt precious and irreplaceable. Dad lived for 2 more weeks after that heart attack, 2 weeks during which the Hartmans maintained a constant presence that felt more like an occupation than support. They were always there when I arrived, always staying late into the evening, always positioning themselves as the responsible, caring family members while I was painted as the emotional daughter who couldn't handle the practical realities of end-of-life care. They brought legal documents for Dad to sign, always when I wasn't there, always with explanations about protecting his assets and making sure his wishes were properly documented and legally binding. When I tried to talk to Dad about his will, about what he wanted to leave behind and how he wanted to be remembered, he'd get agitated and confused in ways that broke my heart. "The lawyers have been here, little bird," he'd say, his voice weak but certain. "David explained everything to me. It's all taken care of, all properly arranged. You don't need to worry about any of that legal stuff. Just focus on taking care of yourself. You look so tired all the time now." Even while dying, my father was worried about me, concerned about my well-being in that selfless way that had defined our relationship my entire life. That's the kind of man he was, always putting other people's needs ahead of his own, always trying to solve problems and fix things even when he was the one who needed help. The funeral was a blur of flowers and condolences, and people telling me how lucky I was to have such a supportive family during this difficult time. The Hartmans had taken care of all the arrangements, they said, had handled everything so I could just focus on grieving and healing. I stood at the graveside watching them accept sympathy and praise for their generosity and thoughtfulness, feeling like a stranger at my own father's funeral, like I was watching someone else's family say goodbye to someone else's loved one. After the service, Patricia pulled me aside with that concerned expression she'd perfected over the years, the one that looked like genuine care but felt like calculation. "Sarah, honey, we know this is incredibly hard, but we need to talk about your father's affairs and his final wishes. He made some changes to his will in those final weeks, and we want to make sure you understand his reasoning and his concerns. He was very worried about your financial security, especially with your teaching salary and the stress you've been under. He wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of properly." The way she said it made my stomach drop with a dread I couldn't quite name. There was something in her tone, a mixture of false sympathy and barely concealed satisfaction, that told me I wasn't going to like what came next. But I was exhausted from grief and the emotional toll of the past months, so I just nodded and agreed to meet with the lawyer the following week, trusting that whatever Dad had decided would make sense once I heard the details. That brings me back to this office, to this moment that's about to shatter everything I thought I knew about my father's final wishes, and the people I'd trusted with both our lives. Mr. Harrison, Dad's longtime lawyer, is a thin man with kind eyes who's known our family for over 20 years. He handled my parents' wills when Mom died, helped Dad with some property disputes over the years, and always treated our small legal matters with the same care and attention he'd give to million-dollar estates. Today, though, he seems uncomfortable in a way that's completely unlike him, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact, clearing his throat repeatedly, like he's trying to find the right words for something difficult. The Hartmans are arranged around the conference table, like they're attending a board meeting rather than a family gathering, their posture and expressions radiating confidence and satisfaction. Patricia sits directly across from me, her hands folded perfectly in her lap, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than I make in a month. David's father, Robert Sr., has positioned himself at the head of the table, like he's chairing a corporate meeting, his presence commanding and authoritative. David sits beside his mother, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand in what I'm sure looks like supportive comfort, but feels more like a restraint, like he's making sure I stay calm and compliant. Mr. Harrison clears his throat and begins reading from the official document, his voice taking on that formal legal tone that makes everything sound more serious and final. The last will and testament of Robert Chen, dated 6 weeks before his death. As he reads through the standard legal language about sound mind and disposing of worldly goods, I find myself thinking about the timing, about how 6 weeks before his death was right in the middle of Dad's worst confusion, when he was most susceptible to outside influence and least able to think clearly about complex decisions. It was also when the Hartmans' visits became most frequent and most insistent, when they started bringing those legal documents I'd found scattered around his kitchen. The first few bequests are small and expected, the kind of personal items that carry emotional weight, rather than financial value. Dad's tools go to his neighbor, Mr. Peterson, who'd borrowed them for years and always returned them in better condition than he'd found them. His collection of old photographs, the ones documenting our family's history and his relationship with my mother, goes to my brother Michael in California. His wedding ring, the simple gold band he'd worn for 43 years until Mom died, and he'd started keeping it in a small box by his bedside, goes to me. I feel a small surge of relief at this last item, grateful that he'd remembered some things should stay within the immediate family. Patricia reaches across the table and pats my hand with that false sympathy I've come to despise, her touch cold and condescending. Sarah, honey, I know this might seem surprising at first, but your father was very clear about his reasoning and his concerns. He wanted to make sure you'd have ongoing family support, not just a lump sum of money that might not last. He knew we'd take care of you the way he always did, that you'd never have to worry about being alone or struggling financially. This way, you'll always have family looking out for you. The condescension in her voice is breathtaking, the way she's explaining my own father's will to me like I'm a child who can't understand adult decisions or complex financial planning. She's talking about taking care of me like I'm a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected, like my father's final act of love was to ensure I'd never have to think for myself or make my own decisions about my future. David squeezes my shoulder and adds his own explanation, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I've learned to hate. Dad was really thoughtful about this, Sarah. He knew that inheriting a house and managing investments would be stressful for you, especially while you're still grieving and trying to process everything. This way, the family can handle all the complicated financial stuff, and you can just focus on healing and moving forward. You'll never have to worry about property taxes or market fluctuations or any of that complicated business. I want to scream, want to flip this polished conference table and demand to know exactly what they did to my father. How they convinced a man who'd spent his whole life being careful with money and protective of his family to suddenly decide that virtual strangers deserved his life's work more than his own daughter. But I'm outnumbered and overwhelmed, sitting in their lawyer's office surrounded by their confident smiles and reasonable explanations, and part of me is starting to wonder if maybe I really was too emotional, too stressed to see the situation clearly. Maybe Dad really did think this was best for me. Maybe he really was worried about my ability to handle financial responsibilities. Maybe he saw something in my character or my capabilities that made him think I needed to be managed rather than trusted. The dementia had made him confused about so many things toward the end. Maybe it had also made him forget who I really was, forget the competent, independent woman he'd raised me to be. Mr. Harrison is still reading through the technical details of asset transfer and estate administration, explaining how the house will be transferred, and when the financial accounts will be accessible, but I'm not really listening anymore. I'm thinking about all those conversations Dad and I had about the future, about how he wanted to make sure I'd be okay after he was gone, about his pride in the house he'd paid off early, and the savings account he'd built through decades of careful living. He'd always said those things would be mine someday, that they were his way of taking care of me even after he couldn't be there to help anymore. Had I imagined those conversations, had the stress of watching him decline made me hear promises that were never really made? The dementia had made him confused about so many things. Maybe he'd forgotten those earlier conversations, or maybe I'd misunderstood his intentions from the beginning. Maybe I'd been so focused on being the devoted daughter that I'd missed the signs that he was losing confidence in my abilities, that he was starting to see me as someone who needed protection, rather than someone who deserved trust. Robert Sr. Lynn's back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who's just won something important, his voice carrying the authority of someone who's used to being listened to and obeyed. Robert was a wise man, he says, using my father's name with a familiarity that makes me want to vomit. He understood that family means more than just blood relationships, it means commitment and responsibility and genuine care. He saw how much we loved him, and how much we cared about his well-being, and he wanted to make sure that same level of care would continue for Sarah after he was gone. The way he says, "My name," makes me feel like a charity case, like someone who needs to be managed and supervised rather than loved and respected. I look around the table at these people who are now, apparently, my financial guardians and benefactors, and I feel smaller and more powerless than I've ever felt in my entire life. They're talking about me like I'm not even in the room, discussing my future like it's their decision to make, planning my life like I'm incapable of having opinions or preferences about my own existence. But then Mr. Harrison does something completely unexpected that changes the entire atmosphere in the room. He stops reading from the will and looks directly at me, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to something that looks almost like apology mixed with anticipation. "There is, however, one more item that your father left specific instructions about," he says quietly, his voice carrying a weight that makes everyone in the room sit up and pay attention. "He asked me to handle this final piece only after the reading of the will proper, and only under certain very specific conditions." He reaches into his briefcase and pulls out a small digital recorder, the kind Dad used to use for making notes about repair jobs and keeping track of parts he needed to order. The sight of it makes my heart skip, because it's so distinctly his, practical and slightly outdated but perfectly functional, exactly the kind of tool he'd choose for something important. Mr. Harrison places it carefully on the table between us, and I can see uncertainty creeping into the Hartmans' confident expressions for the first time since we sat down. Patricia's perfect composure slips just slightly, and her voice is sharper than it's been all morning. "What kind of conditions?" she asks, leaning forward with an intensity that betrays her growing anxiety. Robert never mentioned any recording to us, never said anything about additional instructions or special circumstances. "We were involved in all the estate planning discussions, Mr. Harrison's smile is thin and professional, but there's something in his eyes that looks almost like satisfaction. "Mr. Chen was very specific about the circumstances under which this recording should be played," he says, his finger hovering over the play button. "He said I would know when the time was right, when certain events had occurred exactly as he predicted they would. Those conditions have now been satisfied." He presses play, and suddenly my father's voice fills the room, clear and strong and more lucid than he'd sounded in months before his death. The sound hits me like a physical blow, but it's not the confused, fragile voice I'd been hearing toward the end. This is the father I remember from before the illness, sharp and thoughtful and completely in control of his faculties, speaking with the kind of clarity and purpose that makes it impossible to doubt his mental competency. Little bird, if you're hearing this recording, it means they did exactly what I thought they would do. It means the will was read exactly as I wrote it, and you're sitting in that office feeling betrayed and abandoned and wondering how your old dad could have forgotten everything we meant to each other. Well, I didn't forget anything, sweetheart. I've been watching them, watching and listening, and remembering more than they think I remember. They believe that because my mind wanders sometimes, I don't notice when people are trying to manipulate me or take advantage of my confusion. They're wrong about that, just like they're wrong about a lot of things. Patricia's face has gone pale, and David is staring at the recorder like it might explode at any moment. Robert Sr. leans forward with a frown that suggests this is not going according to any plan he'd anticipated. When was this recorded? He demands, but Mr. Harrison holds up a hand for silence, indicating that we need to hear the entire message before any questions will be answered. Dad's voice continues, steady and certain, carrying all the love and wisdom I'd missed so desperately over the past months. I know about the documents they brought me to sign, Sarah. I know about the conversations they had with me when you weren't there, about the lies they told about your wishes and your capabilities. I know about their suggestions that you were too emotional to handle adult responsibilities, too overwhelmed to make good decisions about my care. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man who couldn't tell the difference between genuine care and calculated manipulation. They were wrong about that too. My hands are shaking now, gripping the edge of the conference table as Dad's words wash over me like a revelation. He knew. He'd known what they were doing all along, had been aware enough to see through their manipulation, even when his mind was failing in other ways. The relief is overwhelming, but it's mixed with anger and grief for all the doubt I'd carried, all the times I'd questioned my own perceptions and wondered if I was being paranoid or unfair. The will you just heard read is real, little bird. I did sign those papers, and I did leave my estate to the Hartmans exactly as Mr. Harrison described. But what they don't know, what they couldn't have known, is that 3 months before I got sick, when my mind was still completely clear and I could see what kind of people they really were, I moved the majority of my actual assets into a separate trust, a trust that only you can access, with documentation that proves when it was established and why it was necessary. The room erupts in shocked voices and angry protests, but Dad's recorded voice cuts through all of it, with the kind of authority he'd always possessed when something important needed to be said. The house on Oak Street that they think they're inheriting has a second mortgage on it that I took out 6 months ago, using the equity to fund your trust. The savings account they're so excited about contains exactly enough money to cover that mortgage and the property taxes for 1 year. The investment portfolio they think they're getting is worth about $3,000 in penny stocks I bought as a joke, companies that don't exist anymore, and certificates that aren't worth the paper they're printed on. David's face is red now, and he's looking at Mr. Harrison with something approaching panic. This can't be legal, he says, his voice cracking with desperation. If he was having cognitive issues, he couldn't have made these kinds of financial decisions without proper oversight or medical clearance. There have to be laws about this kind of thing. Mr. Harrison's expression remains calm and professional, but I can see the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The trust was established 14 months ago, Mr. Hartman, well before your father-in-law's diagnosis, and well before any of the documents you witnessed him signing. I have medical records confirming his complete mental competency at the time, as well as video documentation of the entire trust creation process. Everything was done according to the strictest legal standards, with multiple witnesses and independent verification. Dad's voice continues from the recorder, and I can hear both love and sadness in his tone, the voice of a man who'd had to make difficult decisions to protect someone he loved. Sarah, the real estate, the real savings, the real investments, they're all waiting for you in that trust. But more than that, I've been documenting everything they've done, every conversation, every document they brought me, every lie they told about what you wanted for me. Mr. Harrison has copies of everything, recordings and photographs, and detailed notes about every interaction I had with the Hartman family. I look at the lawyer with new understanding, and he nods gravely. Your father was very thorough, Sarah. He recorded conversations, photographed documents, and kept detailed notes about every interaction he had with your in-laws. He was building a comprehensive case, not just for the inheritance, but for what he called the protection of his daughter's future and reputation. The recording isn't finished, and Dad's voice grows softer, more personal, speaking directly to me in that way that always made me feel like the most important person in his world. Little bird, I need you to understand something that's more important than any amount of money. I didn't do this to hurt anyone or to play games with people's expectations. I did this because I love you, and because I could see what they were doing to you, how they were slowly convincing you that you weren't capable of handling adult responsibilities or making good decisions about important things. Tears are streaming down my face now, but they're not tears of sadness or grief. They're tears of relief and vindication, and overwhelming gratitude for a father who'd protected me, even when I thought he'd forgotten me, even when I'd started to doubt my own worth and capabilities. I watched them isolate you, Sarah. I watched them make you doubt yourself, convince you that you weren't smart enough or strong enough or responsible enough to take care of me or manage my affairs. I watched them try to steal, not just my assets, but your confidence and your sense of your own worth. That's why I had to do this, why I had to let them think they'd won while I made sure you'd be protected. There's a pause in the recording, and then Dad's voice returns with a strength that reminds me of every important conversation we'd ever had, every moment when he'd helped me understand something crucial about life or love or standing up for what's right. To the Hartman family, if you're listening to this, you should know that every document you convinced me to sign was witnessed and recorded. Every lie you told about Sarah's wishes was documented. Every manipulation was noted and preserved. You thought you were taking advantage of a sick old man, but you were actually confessing your intentions and methods to someone who was much more aware than you realized. Patricia is crying now, but they're tears of rage and humiliation rather than sadness, her perfect composure completely shattered. "This is fraud," she says, her voice shaking with emotion. He was mentally incompetent during those final months. Those trust documents can't possibly be valid if he was suffering from dementia. Mr. Harrison opens a thick folder and spreads several official-looking documents across the table with the kind of precision that suggests he's been preparing for this moment for months. "Mrs. Hartman, your father-in-law was evaluated by 3 independent physicians during the period when he established the trust. All 3 confirmed his complete mental competency and his ability to make complex financial decisions. Additionally, he underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation specifically to ensure that his decisions were being made freely and without any form of coercion or undue influence. The trust is completely legal and absolutely ironclad." Dad's voice comes through the speaker one final time, and I can hear all the love and pride and hope he'd always had for my future. "Sarah, my little bird, you're stronger than you know and more capable than they've tried to convince you. Take what I've left you and build the life you deserve, the life your mother and I always dreamed you'd have. Don't let anyone make you feel small or dependent or less than you are ever again. I love you, and I'm proud of you, and I'll always be watching over you, making sure you remember how to fly." The recording ends, and the silence in the room is deafening except for the sound of my own crying, tears of relief and gratitude and overwhelming love for a man who'd found a way to protect me even from beyond the grave. I'm not crying quietly or trying to maintain composure anymore. I'm sobbing openly, not caring what anyone thinks, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what my father had done for me and the lengths he'd gone to ensure I'd be safe and secure and valued. Harrison begins explaining the details of the trust, the properties and accounts and investments that are actually mine, the financial security my father had built for me through decades of careful planning and sacrifice. But I'm barely listening to the specifics because I'm thinking about all those Sunday afternoons when Dad seemed confused and distant, realizing now that he was probably planning this entire elaborate protection scheme while pretending to be more impaired than he actually was. I'm thinking about how he must have felt, watching the Hartmans manipulate him while having to pretend he didn't understand what was happening, having to let them think they were succeeding while he documented their every move and protected me in ways I never could have imagined. The strength and intelligence and love it must have taken to carry out this plan while dealing with a degenerative disease is almost incomprehensible to me. David tries one more desperate attempt to salvage the situation, his voice pleading in a way I've never heard before. Sarah, we can work this out like reasonable people. We're family. We can share everything, make sure everyone's taken care of fairly. That's what your father would have wanted, for all of us to support each other and work together. We don't have to let lawyers and legal technicalities tear our family apart. But I'm done being managed and manipulated and told what my father would have wanted by people who barely knew him, and certainly never understood him. I'm done being treated like someone who needs to be protected from her own decisions and capabilities. I stand up from the table, feeling stronger and more certain than I have in months, maybe years. No, David, I say, my voice steady, despite the tears still streaming down my face. What my father wanted was for me to be free from people who see me as something to be controlled rather than someone to be loved and respected. What he wanted was for me to understand my own worth and stop letting other people define my value or my capabilities. What he wanted was for me to remember that I'm his daughter, and he raised me to be strong and independent and capable of taking care of myself. I turned to Mr. Harrison, who's watching this confrontation with the kind of professional interest that suggests he's seen family dynamics explode in his office before. When can I access the trust? I ask, and he smiles with genuine warmth for the first time all day. Immediately, Sarah, your father made sure there would be no delays, no bureaucratic obstacles, no waiting periods. He wanted you to be able to start your new life right away, without having to depend on anyone else's timeline or approval. As I walk out of that office, leaving the Hartmans to deal with their worthless inheritance and their shattered schemes, I feel something I haven't felt in years. I feel free. I feel valued. I feel like my father's daughter again, like the woman he'd raised me to be before I'd let other people convince me I was less capable and less worthy than I actually am. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and new beginnings and the gradual rebuilding of my sense of self and my confidence in my own judgment. The Hartmans tried to contest the will and the trust, of course hiring expensive lawyers and claiming that Dad had been mentally incompetent and that I'd somehow manipulated him into changing his estate planning. But Dad's documentation was thorough and damning, painting a clear picture of elder abuse and systematic manipulation that made their legal position completely untenable. The recordings of their conversations with Dad, the photographs of the documents they'd brought him to sign, the medical evaluations proving his competency when he established the trust. All of it combined to create an overwhelming case that exposed their true motivations and methods. Their lawyers eventually advised them to drop the contest and accept the reality of the situation, that they'd been outmaneuvered by a man they'd underestimated. David filed for divorce within 6 weeks, claiming that I'd hidden assets from him during our marriage and that the breakdown of trust made our relationship impossible to continue. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic, him divorcing me for inheriting money from my own father, money he'd tried to steal through manipulation and deceit. I didn't contest the divorce or fight for any of his assets. I just wanted to be free of the entire family and their toxic approach to relationships and money. I used part of the inheritance to buy a small house near the school where I teach, a place that's entirely mine with no mortgages or strings attached, no one else's name on the deed or opinions about how I should live my life. I set up a scholarship fund in Dad's name for students who want to pursue careers in skilled trades. honoring his belief that honest work has dignity regardless of how much money it pays or how much social status it carries. But the most important thing the inheritance gave me wasn't financial security or independence, though those things matter more than I'd realized when I was struggling to make ends meet on a teacher's salary. The most important gift was the knowledge that I'd been loved completely and unconditionally by someone who saw my worth even when I couldn't see it myself. Someone who'd been willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect me and ensure my future happiness. Dad's final gift wasn't just money or property or financial freedom. It was the restoration of my confidence, my sense of self-worth, my understanding that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting from people who claimed to love me. He'd given me back my belief in my own capabilities and my right to be treated with respect and genuine care, rather than condescension and manipulation. I still visit his grave every Sunday, bringing fresh flowers and telling him about my week, about the students who are thriving, and the house projects I'm learning to do myself, and the peace I've found in a life that's entirely my own. Sometimes I call him Little Bird, the way he used to call me, because I finally understand that we were both learning to fly, both figuring out how to be strong and independent while still maintaining our capacity for love and connection. My father didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me a lesson that love isn't proven in what we give, but in what we protect. He protected my future, my dignity, my right to be valued for who I am, rather than what I can provide to others. He taught me that real family doesn't manipulate or control or try to make you smaller than you are. Real family empowers and protects and believes in your strength even when you've forgotten it yourself. If you felt something with this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and watch the next story that's appearing on your screen right now. You won't regret it.